الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن سار على نهجه وتمسك بسنته إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today's very short reminder on this snowy afternoon in Birmingham is about a concept in Arabic known as Futuwwa. So this reminder is primarily targeted at our young men and our men, but hopefully we can all take some benefit. So a fata in Arabic is literally a young man, but when it's used figuratively, it denotes a number of virtues and characteristics, noble characteristics. So this concept of futuwwa, I'm going to be using this term quite a bit, encompasses what we know as chivalry, honor, courage, generosity, and essentially khidmah and the service of other people. So a fata, a young man, encompasses all of these things. So that's interesting. When we typically think of young men or this age group, it's an age where there's a lot of strength, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of zeal in this age group. Now the concept of futuwwa essentially seeks to focus this and channel this in a way that is productive. The Prophet ﷺ described Ali radiallahu anhu as someone who was, he said, La fata illa Ali, La fatan illa Ali, wa la sayf illa dhul fiqar. So La fata illa Ali, there's no chivalrous youth. There's no one who is like Ali radiallahu anhu when it comes to his valor, when it comes to his honor, when it comes to his courage. And we know that Ali radiallahu anhu is somebody who was courageous, who was steadfast, who became Muslim at a very young age, whilst he was very young, and he stood for justice all the way up until his death radiallahu ta'ala anhu. The Quran also refers to Ibrahim alayhi salam as a fata. In the ayah it's mentioned, قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا فَتًى يَذْكُرُهُمْ يُقَالُ لَهُ إِبْرَاهِيم. So when the polytheists that Ibrahim alayhi salam used to live amongst at the time, they came to find that their idols had been destroyed. They said, well, we've heard this fata, we've heard this young man who's always talking about the idols. His name's Ibrahim. So this suggests that Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he actually did this, when he was reasoning with his people, trying to demonstrate the futility of idol worship, when he was debating with them, when he was going through this process of establishing the tawheed in that particular area, and he was tying knots and showing the faultiness of their logic, when he didn't succumb to the peer pressure that was there from his colleagues or his friends, the peer pressure that would have been there from his family, as we know that a lot of them were engaged in idol worship, the peer pressure that was there from the society at the time, Ibrahim alayhi salam as a young man doesn't succumb to that peer pressure. So what it means, so this signifies for us, so it shows us what it means to be a young man. Even when this incident happened, the villagers, they would go out to celebrate Eid, and we know Eid is a time where a young man will give himself carte blanche, or he'll give himself a license to kind of push the limits a bit, go out to Ladypool Road and get up to all sorts. But even at this point, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he says, I'm not going to go out, I'll just stay back. I'm not going to engage in this type of celebration. I'm not going to engage in these type of questionable celebrations. So Ibrahim alayhi salam is described in the Quran as a fata when he is going through this. Ali radiallahu anhu, for all that he achieved whilst he was young and throughout his life, was described at the peak of his courage and the steadfastness that he displayed, described as a fata by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we know also that the people that went into the cave in Surah Al-Kahf, they're described as a persecuted group of young men. They were young men when this happened, and they went through those trials and tribulations. So what does it mean to be a man? So there's a link between rujula, manliness, what it means to be a man in Islam, futuwwa, this chivalry that one has, and muru'ah is another concept where somebody carries themselves in a dignified way. So futuwwa, which is primarily what we're talking about today, encapsulates honor, it encapsulates courage, generosity, and the service of others. Now typically when we think of what it means to be a man, what comes to mind, and unfortunately in our communities, is somebody who's emotionless, someone who's domineering, someone who's impulsive, someone who, especially with our kids, somebody who's materialistic, and someone who can often be self-centered, especially when we look at the type of world that we live in. But when we refer to the lives of the prophets, who are a guidance for us and exemplary models as to how a man should conduct himself, how a father should conduct themselves, how a son conduct themselves, how anyone in society should conduct themselves, we find that the picture of their personalities, their character traits, and what they embodied in terms of manliness or in terms of masculinity is completely at odds with this. There's really a lot of nuance in terms of the way that we could describe them. So, for example, in terms of being emotionless or cold or aggressive, the Prophet ﷺ is described as others as being, I never saw anyone who was more compassionate towards children than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said that a good deed done to an animal is like a good deed done to a human being. So his compassion and the emotion that he felt towards children, towards even animals, and cruelty towards human beings and cruelty towards animals. He was somebody who was full of emotion, full of compassion, even compassion that would extend to his enemies, as we know when he returned back into Mecca, he forgave absolutely everybody who had persecuted them. We know that even on the battlefield, the place where things often get a bit hairy and lines get blood, the Prophet ﷺ made clear instructions not to harm children, not to harm women, not to harm even plant life. Even plant life, when you go into a particular area, you're not supposed to touch or harm or damage those things. So the Prophet ﷺ is the epitome of compassion and the epitome of somebody who had emotional intelligence, which is something unfortunately that we lack, or it's not the first thing that comes to mind when we think about when we think about being a man or manliness. Ibn al-Qayyim, he describes being a man as al-futuwwa as kafful adha wa badlun nada. Essentially, futuwwa, or this chivalry that we're talking about, this concept of masculinity that we're referring to, or this element of masculinity, is kafful adha, is to avert harm from people in all of its forms, whether it's physical harm, whether it's harm in terms of speech, anything, emotional harm. Averting harm from people is essentially what futuwwa is. Wa badlun nada, and spreading this sort of spreading goodness to people. Another thing that we find from when we reflect on the lives of the Prophets alayhim as-salatu was-salam is that they were incredibly patient. So they all had this concept, or they all had this attribute. In the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions Ismaila wa Idrisa wa dhil qifl kullun min as-sabirin. All of them were amongst the patient, and we see this trait in, without exception, all of the prophets. They were extremely patient. They were people who were patient with others. They were patient with those close to them. They were patient with the people that they encountered, and even the people that were that they weren't so familiar with. They exhibited patience with absolutely everybody, and they overlooked people's mishaps. They would overlook people's mistakes. Yeah, they did ihsan to other people, even though that ihsan was not necessarily reciprocated all of the time. Yeah, and they were definitely not people to hold grudges. Another characteristic that we find from the Prophets ﷺ and the best of generations is that they were not confrontational. Whether it be in the house or whether it be outside of the house, they would never get themselves into a situation where they'd fall into disputation or argumentation. And they didn't have any enmity towards other people. So enmity in terms of speech, enmity in terms of actions towards others, and not even holding enmity in their hearts towards other people. The Prophet ﷺ famously says that, I guarantee a house in paradise for the one who gives up arguing, even if he is right. Imagine that you're in the house, you get into an argument with a sibling, you get into an argument with your mother, you get into an argument with your wife. Even if you're right, if you give up arguing, the Prophet ﷺ says that he guarantees a house in paradise for that person. And this is essentially a quality that Rasulullah ﷺ wants us as men to inculcate, and that the scholars describe as being one of futuwwa, leaving disputation, getting drawn into arguments. Getting drawn into arguments, whether it's online or otherwise, is not the sign of being a man. It's not a manly quality to be bickering about things online. It's not a manly quality to be bickering about things with siblings. It's not a manly quality to be bickering about things with your parents or with your children. And with the Prophet ﷺ, we see that his ability to forgive people, not to have enmity towards anyone, extended to those who were absolutely horrific towards him. They'd committed some of the worst crimes. One of the things that comes to mind is Hind bint Utbah. Hind bin Utbah was somebody who was behind the murder of Hamza radiallahu anhu, and Hamza radiallahu anhu was the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who was mutilated. He was killed and he was mutilated. And Hind, this particular Sahabiya, at the time, this was before she accepted Islam, she came forth and she attempted to even eat his liver. Incredibly malicious act. But when she came to the Prophet ﷺ, after having become Muslim and after having converted to Islam, he accepted her. Complete forgiveness. Accepted her with grace and absolute forgiveness. He answered any of her questions. He even went on to give her personal advice and advise her on her marriage. So we see Rasulullah ﷺ holding grudges against people. Holding grudges is one of these qualities that goes against futuwwa. It's against rujula. It's not a manly quality to hold grudges in your heart, to the point where it affects the way that your own character and your own personality. If you are affected by a grudge that you have, something that you hold deep in your heart towards somebody else, and that affects your behavior, that's not a manly quality. It's definitely not a prophetic quality. Another example is Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He used to give money to a relative of his. So this relative of his was very poor, and he was in need of financial assistance. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu used to give him a donation. There was something that happened in the seerah where Aisha radiallahu anha, Ummul Mu'mineen, or the mother of the believers, she was slandered. So there was a shameful slander that was thrown at her, for which she was later absolved. But one of the people that was involved in this slander was the relative that Abu Bakr used to give money to. Now Aisha is the daughter of Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr says, look, I'm not going to give this guy money again. It's not going to happen. Why should I give him money? He's been spreading this slander about my daughter. Yeah, there's no way I'm going to give him money after this. And after he says this, yeah, interesting, listen up to this. After he says this, wahi is revealed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals a verse saying, don't let the virtuous, or don't let those of virtue amongst you, and those people who happen to have wealth, swear not to give it to the needy. Yeah, so don't swear that you're not going to give wealth to the needy as a result of this grudge that you're going to hold into your heart. And the ayah goes on, وَلْيَعْفُوا وَلْيَصْفَحُوا. Yeah, they should pardon and they should overlook and they should forgive people. Yeah, would you not love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you? Would you not love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you? Wallahu ghafurur rahim. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving and merciful. Allah is forgiving and merciful. Allah forgives and overlooks your issues all the time. Who are you to hold a grudge against anybody else? And Abu Bakr, of course, he goes on to continue to give charity to that person. So holding a grudge is something that is essentially against futuwwa. It's against this chivalry or this quality of manliness that we should aim to inculcate in our children, in our teens. As we say, it means to be a young man. So these are traits that we're supposed to have. As young men, we don't have grudges towards others. The next quality that I wanted to mention was being impulsive. Imam Ahmad radiallahu anhu, he describes futuwwa as tarku ma tahwa lima takhsha, or li ajli man takhsha. So leaving things that you desire, leaving things that you act on impulse. You want something and you just do it, or you want something and you just seek it. So you're constantly sort of submitting yourself to your desires. And Imam Ahmad describes futuwwa, being a man, as being somebody who can control that. You don't give into your desires. You don't give into your desires due to the fact that you are considering the one that you have khashya of. The ultimate person that you should have khashya of is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you leave that which you desire because of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you have. And Imam Ahmad is the Imam of Sunnah, and he sees futuwwa and rujula as having control over one's desires, because one might fear falling into the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So being impulsive. And another thing about being impulsive could be behaving hastily. Now we see this unfortunately a lot. We've seen this in the last few weeks, especially in the context that we're in. People behaving hastily. People behaving on impulse. You get a forward message on WhatsApp and you forward it on to 100 odd people. You get a guy who goes online, he reads a few web pages, goes on some government documents, goes on some NHS websites, reads some stuff that he has no business reading, he has no understanding of what's going on, and the first thing he does, he puts a video together and he spreads it out. Spreads fitna, spreads fasad. This kind of impulsive behavior, this kind of hasty behavior of just putting things out there, putting content out there, it's not a manly thing to do. It's not a manly thing to spread fitna on the basis of knowledge that simply you don't have. To behave impulsively like this and to be hasty like this, the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-ajalatu min ash-shaytan. Yeah, this kind of hasty behavior is from shaitan ultimately. Yeah, because these people have no business doing this, and we've seen with the forwards that have gone out, there's so much confusion that's out there. There's so much, unfortunately, our communities succumb to essentially conspiracy theories because people behave in this impulsive way when they have no need to, and they're definitely not well placed to be giving advice on these types of things. These go against futuwwa. They definitely go against hikmah, wisdom, and they go against the way that a man should be conducting himself. The next quality that I wanted to mention was being self-centered. So we find from the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was always in the service of others. He was always in the service of other people, whether it was inside the house or in the broader community. His wife Aisha radiallahu anha, she describes him as somebody who'd mend his own clothes. He would milk his own sheep. And he'd serve himself. Yeah. On another occasion she said that he sallallahu alaihi wasallam would help his wives prepare meals. Just think about that for a second. Think about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the epitome of what it means to be a man. She says radiallahu anha, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam kana fi mihnati ahlihi. He was constantly in the service of his family. Yeah, not get back from work, long shift, feet up on the table, TV's on, serve me, bring me this, bring me that. Kana fi mihnati ahlihi. And nobody was busier than the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Aisha radiallahu anha, what we see here is as well, and from amongst the Sahaba, if we look amongst the Sahaba, they were so confident in their own masculinity, so confident in their own rujula and futuwwa, that if a woman was to speak up, it didn't affect them. It wasn't something that they felt self-conscious or they felt insecure about. In fact, with Aisha radiallahu anha, something very interesting worth mentioning is Az-Zarkashi, an 8th century scholar, 8th century Hijri scholar. He writes about the times that Aisha radiallahu anha disagrees, not just disagrees, she corrects the companions. The times that Aisha radiallahu anha corrects the companions. So imagine this, there are times where she corrects Umar radiallahu anhu, and who's Umar? She corrects Ali radiallahu anhu. She corrects Abdullah bin Abbas. She corrects Abdullah bin Umar. She corrects Abdullah bin Amr ibn al-As. She corrects Abu Hurairah. She corrects Ibn Mas'ud. The list goes on and on and on. So there's a whole collection that Az-Zarkashi puts together, where Fatima radiallahu anhu, she corrects not just Sahaba. These aren't just people who happen to meet the Prophet once or twice. These are heads of the Sahaba. These are people who went on to become khulafa. These are people who went on to, they were the main references when it came to tafsir of the Quran. They were the main references when it came to matters of fiqh. Yeah, so an example is that when somebody passed away, there was a funeral, and at the funeral people were crying. Abdullah bin Umar, who was one of the main companions, especially when it came to fiqh, he was a reference. Abdullah bin Umar, he says that the Prophet ﷺ said that you shouldn't cry over the deceased, because the crying of the family is a means for the deceased being punished. And he says that Umar actually used to agree with this as well. Umar actually agreed with this as well. Now Aisha, when she heard this, she said, may God have mercy on Umar radiallahu anhu. May God have mercy on him. By Allah. The Prophet ﷺ didn't say that. The Prophet ﷺ did not say that. And she responds, she says, look, the Quran says, لا يكلف الله نفسا لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. Yeah, the Quran says no soul bears the burden of another soul. Just because the person is crying over the grave, why does that mean the person in the grave is getting punished? So Aisha directly refutes the interpretation of the other companions. Obviously with utmost respect, you see at the beginning she says, may Allah have mercy on Omar, but no, that's not the way it was. Yeah, another example is this is a hadith which mentions Abu Hurairah mentions this, and Abu Hurairah is the most prolific narrator of a hadith from the companions. He says, whoever performs ghusl, whoever performs the ghusl of the deceased, meaning he does the ritual washing of the person who passes away, they also have to perform ghusl. And whoever touches them, then they have to perform wudu. And when Aisha hears this, her response is, what? So have the deceased Muslims become impure somehow? Have they become najis? Have they become impure? So touching them means that you have to do wudu. Yeah, and what about if a man was to carry the body? So Aisha completely disagrees with this interpretation. Yeah, she completely agrees with this hadith that one would have to redo their wudu. And so the point being, there were women at the time that would voice their opinions. And elevating men, or elevating our young men, doesn't come with degrading or relegating the status of women. Nor does elevating the voices of women, as with Aisha radiallahu anha, it shouldn't be a means for men feeling insecure about their position in society. Hopefully that point is clear. So going back to the point of being selfless, the Prophet ﷺ was always in the service of other people. And there's no other time that you see this more clearly than on the Day of Judgment, when it will be said, or most people will be saying, nafsi, nafsi. They'll be concerned completely with themselves. And the Prophet ﷺ, the epitome of selflessness, will be saying, ummati, ummati. His only concern will be other people. His concern is not for himself. The service that the Prophet ﷺ did throughout his lifetime extends to even the hereafter, where everyone will be concerned with their own deeds. They'll be concerned with their own balance. They'll be concerned with their own accounting for the way that they conducted themselves in this life. And the Prophet ﷺ would say, ummati, ummati, the epitome, as we said, the absolute epitome of selflessness.